As we head into today's accessible communications training focused on plain language, I want to acknowledge that this training was made possible through the SARTAC Technical Assistance Project, created by Self-Advocates Becoming Empowered, that brought together a select group of state teams from across the country last year to receive training in accessible communications techniques. Drew Milne, our content coordinator and peer mentor, and today's speaker, actually led the statewide team that included partners from the Arizona Department of Economic Security, the Arizona Developmental Disabilities Planning Council, and the Southwest Institute for Families and Children. As a result of this project, we are now eager to play a leading role in expanding capacity for the use of accessible communications in Arizona and beyond. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Drew Milne to get started. Drew, the floor is yours.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Drew Milne. I'm the content coordinator and a peer mentor at the Sonoran Center for Excellence in Disabilities at the University of Arizona. And I'd just like to thank all of you for being here today, and thank you to Lizzie for that wonderful introduction. It's great to see so many people excited to learn about accessible communications and plain language. So without further ado, I will get started. All right. So before we go on, I would like to give special thanks to the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, Self-Advocates Becoming Empowered, and the Self-Advocacy Resource and Technical Assistance Center for their assistance on the SARTAC Technical Assistance Project, and for other resources they contributed to this presentation. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the idea of accessibility and why it's important, but I would just like to reiterate and just lay the groundwork, I suppose. So what is accessibility? To put it simply, it's the design of materials, products, and services so that they are more usable to a greater number of people. And it's not just for people with disabilities. Having accessible resources benefits everyone by allowing more voices to contribute to the conversation and allowing information and ideas to be spread. Why accessibility matters? Well, everyone deserves access to resources that can improve their lives. Accessible resources are the clearest way to communicate information. Accessible resources benefit people with disabilities and English language learners, among others. Accessible resources are inclusive, and access is a civil right. And of course, as we say in the disability community, nothing about us without us. Moving into the focus of our presentation today, what is plain language? In a very brief description, it's writing that allows readers to find what they need, understand what they find, and then use that information and act on it. Let's examine that a little bit more. The Plain Language Writing Act of 2010 defines plain language as writing that is clear, concise, well organized, and follows other best practices appropriate to the subject or field and intended audience. It is writing that uses cognitively accessible language, meaning that it is understandable by people both with and without cognitive impairments or disabilities. And it means that your writing is understandable by anybody, essentially. Going into some features of plain language, it is structured with the most important information first. Has shorter sentences and paragraphs, uses more common words, uses consistent terms throughout a piece of writing, and it gives definitions for important, more complex terms or jargon. It also uses examples to help readers understand ideas in a more concrete way. It avoids unnecessary information, uses clear and straightforward language, and uses active voice instead of passive voice. And we'll talk about each of these bullet points further on in the presentation. First, looking at structure. When writing in plain language, you're going to want to break content into short sections at natural stopping points and write headings to help readers predict what's next, as well as navigate the text if they need to. You want to organize content so that it flows logically. And what that means is you put the most important information at the beginning and include background information when necessary later. A quick example, let's say you wanted to write about Medicaid. First, you would introduce the topic and why it is relevant. Then you can go on to explain that Medicaid is a kind of health insurance, what health insurance is, what kind of health insurance there are. Going into a little bit more detail about sentence and paragraph length. Sentences should be about 10 to 15 words long, and paragraphs should be 5 to 7 sentences or fewer. Long sentences and paragraphs can be inaccessible to some readers, and this is because they might lose track of the points of the sentence or paragraph by the time they get to the end. Of course, these are not hard and fast rules, but these are just general guidelines to keep in mind. Continuing on sentence and paragraph length, look for parts of sentences that are set off by commas, parentheses, or dashes. These can often be turned into their own sentences. You can also look for joining words like and ask if the part after the and could be its own sentence. Oftentimes we use filler phrases in our writing, like in order to, which could be changed to just to. A phrase like due to the fact that could just be because, and so on. And once you notice these in your own writing, you can start to break things down, make it shorter and more accessible. Let's talk about run-on sentences. So here I have an example sentence, and it goes, write in plain language so that the wording and structure are so clear that readers can easily find what they need, understand what they find, and use that information. That's a pretty long sentence, almost the size of an entire paragraph. So let's just look and see where we can break up this sentence into smaller chunks. After working it a little bit, it becomes this new sentence, or this new collection of sentences. Write in plain language. When wording and structure are clear, readers can easily find what they need. Readers can also understand what they find and use that information. So you can see with the in this example, when a run-on sentence is broken up, it becomes more easy to read and to break down. Looking now at consistency. If you use one term, for example, the elderly, you're going to want to keep using it rather than senior citizens or other terms for the same thing. Similarly, when writing lists, you want to keep list items parallel, starting with nouns or verbs, for example. For example, here, we have a list that says, go to the website, click the link, and download the file. So now I want to do a little exercise here. So we have a list, and I want you to find which term could be changed to make it more consistent. So the example is, in today's webinar, we will learn to write in plain language, identify plain language writing, plain language translation. Now post in the chat which one you think could be changed to make it more consistent. Yep, people are saying the third bullet point. Plain language translation, yeah. And that's correct, because the third bullet point is the subject is a noun and starts with a noun as opposed to a verb. So changing that becomes translate writing into plain language. So now all of the terms start with a verb, and it's easier to follow. Now let's look at using common words. Using common words helps readers understand what you're saying without needing a dictionary. If your reader has to look up words, their focus is interrupted, and this can make reading comprehension more difficult. For a few examples, you could use must instead of shall, use skilled instead of proficient, help instead of assistance, and so on. And we have some more examples here. The task is laborious should become the task is difficult. I'll attempt to assist her. I'll try to help her. Here's a very useful tool that I found online. It's called the Upgoer 5. And what it does is that it challenges you to write using only the 1,000 words people use most often. And I say 1,000 instead of 1,000 because 1,000 isn't in the top 1,000 words people use most often, excuse me. So, for example, this passage says, these words tell a story using only the 1,000 words people use most often. Even though words aren't hard, you can talk about hard ideas. Easy words can help you talk about hard ideas and let more people understand. You can try to do the same thing with the Upgoer 5. And I'll provide a link to that tool at the end of the presentation. Again, this is something that you can use if you want to challenge yourself to be more, to use more common words in your writing. Providing definitions. When you need to use an obscure or more complex term, you're going to want to define it for your reader. When there is a more complex term that you want to keep, define it and give an example. Defining a complex term when you use it lets the reader understand without needing a dictionary. It lets the reader get familiar with the term that they may see in other contexts. And the definition should ideally come right after the first time you use a complex term. Some more on providing definitions. You don't have to repeat the definition every time you use it after that. You only have to define it the first time. Your definition can be multiple sentences if you need to. And you don't have to define every single way a term can be used. You just need to define the way that you're using it. Avoiding unnecessary words and information. Unnecessary information distracts the reader from the main points of your writing. And including unnecessary information can be confusing and make it hard for the reader to keep track of what they're reading. When you're revising, going back and editing a piece of writing, review each sentence and ask yourself, is this essential to understanding the main topic? And if not, does it emphasize something important? And if neither of those are true, can the sentence be removed? Avoiding ambiguity. Sometimes words and phrases can have multiple meanings. One example is in a piece of writing I saw that says, if you are determined to have a disability, the word determined there can mean a few things. It can mean if you are diagnosed, but the word determined can also mean very insistent. So if you really want to have a disability, and that's not that's not the term that we're trying to use here. To say it more clearly, it would be if your doctor determines you have a disability, or even better, if you are diagnosed with a disability. Talking a little bit now about pronouns. Watch out for words like this, they, or it, when it might be unclear what or who you're talking about. It's often better to say the subject again, or to divide the sentence into two sentences. If the reader isn't sure what they, this, or it refers to, it's hard to keep track. For every pronoun, go back and check how many subjects the pronoun could be referring to. Make sure you always clearly mention the subject before using a pronoun to refer to the subject later. Talking some more about pronouns. For instructive writing, you want to use second-person pronouns. For example, you must provide your ID versus ID must be provided. This shows to the reader that it is something that they need to do. You're going to want to avoid phrases like he or she and his or her when possible. And to use an example, you would say, you must provide your address versus the applicant must provide his or her address. Now let's talk a little bit about figures of speech. Figures of speech, things like similes, metaphors, sarcasm, and other figures of speech may not always be accessible or understandable for people with intellectual disabilities. You should try to avoid these to make any document more accessible. And just to clarify a little bit about figures of speech, a couple that I've defined here. A simile is a comparison using like or as. An example would be as light as a feather or deep like the sea. So comparing things to which they are not literally applicable. A metaphor is a word or a phrase applied to something to which it is not literally applicable. It is usually a comparison, but not always. For example, she is an open book. In this case, she is not literally an open book. She is being compared to an open book because of her openness with information. This may not immediately be understandable to a lot of readers. And finally, idioms are common phrases that have meanings independent of its literal meaning. One common example would be raining cats and dogs. And for people with IDD or for people learning English, they may not pick up on the contextual clues to understand its meaning. A quick note about hidden verbs. You're going to watch out for hidden verbs and avoid them when possible. And a hidden verb is essentially a verb converted into a noun. And it may need an extra verb to make sense. For example, please make an application for a loan is longer and less clear than please apply for a loan. Now let's talk a little bit about active versus passive voice. When possible, you're going to want to use active voice instead of passive voice. This makes the subject and object of a sentence clear. For example, she gave the presentation instead of the presentation was given by her. Sentences written in passive voice are longer and have more complex structure. Sentences written in active voice are more direct and easier to understand. Just in case you guys want a little refresher, we're going to do another exercise here. So I want you to take this first sentence, which is written in passive voice, and then turn it into active voice. Okay, so post in the chat how you guys would change that first sentence. She wrote the essay. A lot of people are posting in the chat, and that's exactly how I would do it. Yeah. Okay. Now let's do the second one. Maria was told where to go by Juan. And people in the chat are saying Juan told Maria where to go. And again, that's exactly how I would do it. You guys are fast. Idea density. When possible, you want to reduce the number of ideas per sentence. For example, this sentence says, members of Congress, your representatives and your senators, have a national office in Washington, D.C., and one or more offices in the state they're from. And we can break this down into multiple sentences, each having one idea, and it flows more logically and it's easier to read. And doing that, the sentence becomes, your representatives and your senators are your members of Congress. Members of Congress have more than one office. Each member of Congress has one national office in Washington, D.C. They also have one or more offices in the state they are from. So even though you might notice it's a little bit longer than the original sentence, but it still flows easier because each sentence has one idea and the sentences are arranged logically. Another tool that you can use to evaluate your writing and make it more accessible is looking at the piece's reading level. Several factors go into reading level, but the most common scale is called the Flesch-Kincaid Readability Score, which is determined by the syllables per word and the words per sentence. And it calculates based on that to the reading level. For plain language, we're going to want to use a 5th to 8th grade reading level, and ideally on the lower end of that spectrum. We talk about reading level using grades, such as a 3rd grade reading level, because it's an easy way to measure readability, but sometimes it can give the wrong idea. Lower reading levels are better for everyone, not just kids. We can write about complicated topics at low reading levels, and we should. And later in this presentation at the end, I'll give you some resources where you can actually copy and paste your own writing, and it will tell you the reading level of that piece of writing. Just to kind of illustrate this, give some examples. Here are 3 passages that say essentially the same thing at 3 different reading levels. The first one is at a 16th grade or a college reading level. And it says, "It is a truth universally acknowledged that dogs, with their amusing antics, adorable faces, and undying loyalty, are beneficial to human beings." Now, there's some complex vocabulary in there. It's a long sentence, a complicated structure. So breaking it down a little bit more to an 8th grade reading level, it says, "Everyone agrees that dogs are beneficial to people. Dogs cheer us up by acting in an amusing way. They look adorable and are endlessly loyal to us." That's better. The vocabulary is more common, and the sentences are broken up a little bit, but we can go even further. Breaking it down now to a 3rd grade reading level, "Dogs are good for people. Everyone says so. Dogs act silly and cheer us up. Dogs look cute. Dogs are loyal to us." Now, when you're taking a more complicated piece of writing and you want to make it more accessible and put it into plain language, you're going to want to keep all of the information that is being conveyed. Plain language is not dumbing down, as some people say. It's about conveying complex information in a simple way. For example, here's a passage, and there have 2 attempts at making it more accessible, one of which removes the information and one of which keeps the information of the original passage. So let's look at the original passage here. "Many autistic students have expressed difficulty accessing information regarding receiving disability accommodations." Going into the translation with the complex idea removed, it says, "Many autistic students say it is hard to get information." This is an easier sentence, but it leaves out the part that the information that autistic students are looking for is specifically about receiving disability accommodations. So when we add that back in a more accessible plain language way, we get this 3rd passage here. "Many autistic students say it is hard to get information about accommodations. Accommodations are changes that make things easier for people with disabilities." And you see there at the end, that's an example of providing a definition. Looking a little bit more at translating or taking a piece of writing that is complex and making it plain language, and comparing that to writing a piece from scratch. When you write from scratch, you get to decide what to include. However, when you translate something that is publicly available, you must include all of the information that is in the original. Now, of course, there are some things you can change in this process, like including more ideas, like background information and definitions. You can reorder information. You could add illustrations, like infographics or icons, etc. Now, I want to see if we can take all of these terms and all of these ideas that we've gone over so far and put them to use. Here is a piece of writing, and we're going to post it in the chat, and we're going to all take about 10 minutes to work on it and see what we can change to make it more plain language. Just making sure that we have that posted in the chat. Okay. So now I want you guys to, if you want, you can copy and paste it and put it into your own word processor. And then in 10 minutes, when we come back, we'll discuss some of the changes that you guys made. So I'll start the timer right now. All right, everybody. So it's been about 10 minutes. Give everyone a few seconds to return here. In the meantime, how about you guys post in the chat about some of the changes that you've made? Let's see. So Claire says, after the interview, your counselor may follow up with you to learn more about your disability. Excellent. Let's see. Lisa wrote, program team members and service providers use this information to support your recovery. The team will only share information with others by, and she made a list, court order, law enforcement investigation, or Social Security Administration request. It's a great idea, using lists to make lots of information flow easier. Let's see. A couple people made lists. Laura says that she added definitions and broke down the steps. Excellent. Lots of people taking the more difficult vocabulary and either changing the terms or providing definitions. Excellent. Yeah, it looks like you guys really did a great job with applying a lot of these principles. Joconda says also making bulleted lists, also very helpful. David says, the counselor may need more information about your disability after the interview. How might your disability impact work? What are your needs for work? Your counselor may ask for more information. That looks pretty good. John McDermott used AI to assist in his plain language translation. Let's look at how that turned out. Looks pretty good. I would recommend, though, if you're going to use AI to assist your plain language translation, always look it over, and always proofread it to make sure it looks good. Make sure all the information stays in there. John says always review. Yeah. So yeah, I think, yeah, you guys did a great job with applying a lot of the principles that we've learned. Anybody else in the chat, you can go read what other people have posted to kind of, to kind of jumpstart your own thinking about how this could go. I've got a few more points to cover before we finish today. Oh, so this is not a strictly plain language thing, but I figured as long as we're here, I would want to point it out for accessible writing purposes about fonts and typeface. You're going to want to use fonts like Tahoma, Calibri, Helvetica, Arial, Verdana, and Times New Roman. These are sans serif fonts, meaning that they don't have extra additions around the letters, which can make them more difficult to read. This makes it easier to distinguish the shapes of different letters and separating one letter from another with overlapping characters or letters. It's not decorative, and it's not a specialty or display font like handwriting, custom, or cursive. And when you're in doubt about whether a piece of writing is accessible or whether it's plain language, one thing you can always do is focus group it. Again, like I mentioned earlier in the presentation, nothing about us without us. And the best way to see if something is accessible to your intended audience is to ask them. Especially if you're making something for people with disabilities, disabled people can know best if something is unclear or wrong. When you do one of these focus groups, you can provide an agenda ahead of time. This lets people plan for the meeting and helps people know what is going on. You can also include questions you might ask, and especially for people with developmental disabilities, it can be hard, or people with autism, it can be hard to answer questions on the spot. So it gives time to think of answers before the meeting, and also to set up any accommodations that may be necessary, like ASL interpreters and so on. Some sample questions to ask a focus group. Does this make sense to you? Are we saying ideas in the right order? Is there too much information or not enough information? And would you change anything to make this better? So some samples questions that you might ask in a focus group. And now we've reached the end of the presentation. I've put a list of resources. You can also see in the chat, you can follow the links to the resources I provided. And we have some time. We've got about 15 minutes. If anyone has any questions, you can post them in the chat or raise your hand, I believe.
Hi, Drew. I have a question that was DM'd.
Okay.
And so I'll read it to you. This person is wondering, when should plain language be used instead of my typical style of writing?
That's a very good question. And it really depends on the audience for which you're writing. Plain language specifically is used for general audiences, meaning that it can be used essentially by anyone. So if you're aiming for a broad-facing work that's going to be viewed by the public, that's when you're going to want to use plain language. Obviously, if you're going to write for something like an academic paper or journal, something that has a bit, that is specifically for an intended audience that is going to be familiar with backgrounds, some more of the difficult terms that you might use, then you can have a little bit higher of that reading level that we mentioned earlier. And if you're going to write something specifically for people with or people with a lower, how do I phrase this? For people with disabilities, for example, developmental disabilities, or people who aren't as proficient in English, you might even want to go even lower than the typical 5th to 8th grade writing level that you would use with most plain language pieces. So Deborah DeGrotto asks, it seems the upgoer 5 identifies words that are not of the 10 to 100, but doesn't offer alternative words. That is a bit of a limitation of the upgoer 5 there. So you're going to want to use that just kind of to check your own writing, but you're going to have to do a little bit more work to provide alternatives there. Let's see. Laura asks, there are examples of a long article with a link to the plain language. So is it comfortable for both types of audiences? I think what you're asking is if long pieces in general can be plain language, and I think they can. As long as the information flows logically, provides definitions for difficult terms, uses common words like we mentioned, then the piece can be as long as it needs to convey that information. Are there examples? I don't have an example that I can go to right now. I can get back to you with that. Steve Dudley asks, did I miss the 10 to 100 link? I believe that's referring to the Upgoer 5, which is the fourth link in the list of resources.